people who are coming to executive coaches, and often they come to them not because it didn't occur to them to set goals and to follow them through. They come to them because they've tried it and it didn't work. Now, why does this behavior, if we know what we need to do, what's important to do, if not doing something hurts us, let's say you're overworking and you should work less. So why can't we just make a plan and stop working? So what happens is that, we go to the executive coach and say, okay, help us stop working. Well, the problem is that if it was only the question of behavior, okay, you decide, you exert some willpower on this behavior, you change your schedule and you have your coach follow you through, and voila, you're done at the end of it. But the problem is that self is not just behavior. Self, you can think of it as consisting of 5 different parts. There's your motivation, your desires. There is the behavior that we talked about. There's your emotions, which are kind of signals about where you stand in relation to your goals. There's your mind, both conscious and the unconscious, that both gives you insights, but also participates in kind of compulsive repetition of old beliefs. And finally, there is all of your history inside of your nervous system, inside of your body, that is carried inside of you and that acts out in the situations, usually in the way that perpetuate old patterns. So now you have these 5 parts of the self, and the person comes in and they want to change this behavior, working less. The problem is that the other 4 parts are actually wanting to work more. So you have a desire to work more because perhaps you feel more valuable. If you work more, you feel more safe. Emotionally, if you work less, you feel guilt or shame. Your beliefs, assumptions about the world, about your value in the world, are all shaped around why working more is better. And finally, your nervous system, which fundamentally houses these unconscious beliefs, is just doing a repeat. And it's just on repeat. And so every time you try to change the behavior, you're moving one part of the self one way, but the other 4 parts are pushing the other way. And so you start breaking yourself. And you can break yourself for a while using your willpower. It's not going to feel great, but you can do it. The problem is it doesn't move the other 4 parts. It just exhausts you until you basically give up. So when most people come to executive coaches is because they've tried it already many times and it didn't work. And somehow they hope that the executive coach has this magic wand that they're going to wave and that's going to help them get to the other side. They're going to feel transformed. They're going to feel changed. Unfortunately, 90% of the problems are not because it just didn't occur to somebody, or they don't know the path, or they don't know how to set the goals. It is because all the rest of the self is pushing the other way. You can think of it as kind of deep problem of both, on one level, wanting to change, to work less, for example, but really on the other level, not wanting to work less. And now into this conflict, you have executive coach who steps in and tries to make a difference. There is thousands of theorists of self who will tell you they focus on different parts. And the reason why I focus on 5 parts of self is because when I was going through my training, my education, through my Ph.D. and postdoctoral work, I've noticed that most psychologists are trained in just one aspect of psyche. So there are people who are focusing on on the mind, on cognitions, or memory. There are people who are focusing on the unconscious desires. So these are your psychoanalysts. There's people who are focusing just on the neuroscience. People who are focusing just on the emotion. And I think what occurred to me is that some of the problems that we have with helping people understand what it takes to transform fully the self, rather than just try to change the behavior forcibly, comes from that fragmentation of understanding the self. And if we could collect back all different parts of the self and understand how to move it in concert, that we could finally produce something that I think most people yearn for, which is a full transformation that doesn't take willpower to maintain, but it is a natural, spontaneous transformation of self. I think it's a bit of an inverse. There is not one that they ignore. There's one that they focus on. They just focus on behavior. And that makes sense. Behavior is observable. It is measurable. When you interact with others, you see the behavior and they see your behavior. So there's many reasons why leaders often focus on the behavior. Your organization will say, okay, show me the behavior that has changed. So even when people conceive of change, they see it in the behavior. So it makes sense. The problem is if you don't know that there are the other four parts. And people, I think, vaguely understand that there is emotions and motivations and their nervous system and their thoughts. But somehow, either because as psychologists, we haven't done our job well in helping people understand what it takes to move all these other parts. Everybody knows how to just change the behavior. They just force themselves to do something different, right? The way that people force themselves not to eat something they want to eat, or to wake up earlier than they otherwise would. So most people intuitively understand how to force behavior change. And I think it's a bit of a failing of the whole psychological field, that we got so fragmented that we can't actually offer a model that helps people move fully as a whole, that then we have this fragmented advice, and also advice that actually doesn't work. You cannot change one or two parts of the self while the other parts are moving the other way. It will just unfortunately, it causes distress and even a little bit of cynicism about whether transformation is actually possible. And I think the trouble that it causes for executive coaches or coaches broadly is that actually, I think sometimes coaches get to the point where they witness the struggle of their clients and they are present with it, and then they witness the struggle. And it's almost like getting to the point where you think, well, I guess that's what this is. It's just their continual struggle, that they'll just have to struggle, and there isn't really a transformation. And so that way, it's like losing hope that there is such a thing as a full transformation. Fundamentally, perhaps people, I worry that the cynicism that we get by just watching people struggle, forcing their behaviors, is that we stop believing that there is such a thing as transformation or full change. Constructs are basically assumptions about the world that we act on. You can think of it as a belief about the world or yourself or other people so if you think people are friendly, you assume people are friendly, then you're going to approach them in a friendly way and they might actually respond. If you think that they're very unfriendly, you're going to approach them as if that were the case. Often I don't use the word even belief, because we have a lot of beliefs that are unconscious to us. So we don't know that our assumption is something. It seems to us our reality. And that's why I call it an assumption. So construct is an assumption about the world that you might not even know you have, that you act on. And we have millions of them, because there's millions of assumptions that we have about ourselves, about other people and the world. And because they're assumptions and often invisible, they can be very dangerous, particularly if they're not accurate. Having an accurate assumption that is invisible to you is very, very dangerous. I think that because we evolved for millennia in an environment in which we only witnessed reality, right? There's nothing else. Most of our perceptions were recorded as fundamentally a truth. It's an assumption that becomes a truth. So if you see the sun go up every morning, and if you see particular animals in your environment, you didn't want to occupy the conscious mind that takes up a lot of energy. You wanted it just to sit inside of you it's part of the learning. You want most of the learning, you don't have to worry about it. It just enters you. The problem is that sometimes in the course, and this is the problem with these constructs or these assumptions, is that sometimes an assumption that's true in one moment can, if you continue believing it, can become very, very dangerous too. And this is what I call a closed construct. So you can think of as an open construct or open assumption or open belief is think of it as an assumption that keeps getting informed by the world. So maybe your assumption about other people changes based on people you meet. You meet a friendly person, an unfriendly person, and somebody, and you slowly over time realize that there's all different kinds of people and you can interact in all different kinds of ways. And that's okay as long as you're open to that learning. But sometimes our nervous system developed a mechanism that if the situation in which you're learning is very, very dangerous, so if there is threat of harm, perceived harm, it basically made it so that learning, that assumption became closed. It's like having a piece of information that is unmodifiable in your unconscious mind. So for example, if I'm interacting with somebody socially and they attack me violently, evolution has made it so that everything that is very, very threatening potentially stays locked in so that it can be so that it's not modifiable, so that in the future you don't change it so that you know how to avoid it all the time. It's a little bit like if I had experience of going into a bear den and poking a bear. Evolution made it so that I would never, ever forget that that's a terrible idea, right? So that piece of information would stay there that says, don't, you see an animal, then just go the other way. And oddly enough, that fact that evolution prepares us to learning to interact with the world well, but occasionally it makes some information in our unconscious modifiable. That is actually what I think is the root of why people can't change. So people often talk about limiting beliefs. Now, what is a limiting belief? Limiting belief is a belief that you got at one point about yourself, for example, about maybe that you're not that smart or that you're not going to make it or whatever it is, that got locked in situation of high threat that now seems immodifiable. So no matter what you say to yourself, no matter how much you practice, no matter how much you do self-talk and meditation and all of these things, your unconscious that works very, very rapidly. So think about your unconscious mind working at the speed of like 11 million bits per second. So it's a very, very powerful data processing machine. Your versus conscious mind that works something like 50 bits per second, okay? So you could be telling yourself that you're smart and you can do it at 50 bits per second, that's your conscious mind. But your unconscious mind is telling you that you're not smart and not good enough at 11 million bits per second. So you're not going to win this one. And this is why most of the behavioral change techniques are so long-standing. Because it's something like, okay, every day you wake up and you tell yourself, I am good enough. Or every evening you go and you summarize all the ways in which you have been smart or learning, right? Because the attempt is to kind of fill the conscious mind with thoughts of I am good enough. And you can do that. And it does what it kind of promises to do. It can fill the mind. But you know what? As soon as you get a little bit tired, or you run out of willpower, or you go to sleep, or you're a little bit stressed, that unconscious mind is going to bulldozer over all of our meditations and all of our self-talk to make us feel, right? And so the central question really that I imagine the coach or executive coach needs to ask themselves is, okay, so let's say that I work with a client and we figure out what they want to change and we start to understand why it is that they're not changing. What are some things that they are carrying or holding inside of themselves that prevents this thing? Well, how do we change this piece of seemingly unmodifiable? How do you change something in the unconscious? That is the question. And once you have a good sense of what it takes to do that, then you have keys to transformation. And that transformation, ironically, is not something slow that happens over time, but very rapid. Just like that, usually that piece of information got locked in under threat. A different kind of experience that also causes dysregulation, but is in a positive, that is self-induced, in which you have a new experience that is a positive experience, is going to turn the key and take that and open up that closed construct. One thing to understand, so let me just even define what is a dysregulation. Dysregulation of what? Usually dysregulation of emotional system. And what causes dysregulation of emotional system? Most of the time, some form of a threat. Okay. And so the reason why dysregulation when we're in the world and learning is so intense, dysregulation, it can be dangerous, is because it makes the brain more plastic, which means that in conditions of great danger, the brain will just catch on. It will close the lid to this teapot or the bowl that is your belief, and can just close it and keep the part of the self from continuing to learn. So let's say that you're learning about yourself, about the world, and you have a dysregulating experience at school, somebody makes fun of you or bullies you. Now that dysregulation tells the brain, remember that. The lid goes on, and now, even though there's other information as you go on in your life, you're still carrying this teapot or bowl from when you were 8. And oddly enough, it doesn't matter that you can be a Nobel Prize winner. And inside of this teapot is still, I am not smart enough. And people experience that all the time. They have beliefs that contradict the reality, and it's because this thing is closed. So the question is, what would make this bowl open so you can pour in new information? The same thing that got it locked in. Dysregulation, accept that. So what's the difference between good dysregulation and a bad dysregulation? Bad dysregulation is the one in which it's from the outside, somebody or the world or somebody else is doing it to you. And second, you don't have any support to deal with the situation that this dysregulation is putting you in. And so what are the conditions needed for transformation are positive dysregulation, which is self-induced dysregulation. You expose yourself under controlled condition to a moderate level of emotional distress. Doesn't sound like fun, but it's not, it's not terrible, right? It's much less than the original event. And in that the second factor that you need is then you offer yourself the support that you needed, that got that lid closed in the first place. So often what makes this lid reopen is going back to those same events, taking ourselves through the event, allowing ourselves to be dysregulated, that kind of makes our brain plastic again, and then providing that support. I sometimes call that self-support, that self-love, it's like a spring on the lid. It keeps the lid open. And that can be done under controlled conditions. You can, some people do it with their coaches or with their therapists, but fundamentally, it's a self-experience. So when I teach people, I teach them to do it by themselves in a room. Sometimes people would prefer to do it with somebody else, which is, I think, a wonderful place also for coach to step in. I've had people ask, I love, the technique. It's very short. You can have a very powerful learning and experience, but I would love it if I had somebody next to me. Wonderful. Or even what coaches can do is help people understand what are these closed teapots, what would it take to open it, and then have people, again, go through these transformative experiences by themselves. In the end, clients themselves need to have the transformative experience. You cannot make them have it, but you can educate them about what it takes. You can help enlighten them, and you can support them through it, whatever that means for them. There's a lot that coaches, I think, can do. And oddly enough, if you were to do all of this, I imagine you would be more successful than a lot of different kinds of therapies are that focus only on one part of the self, like a cognitive behavioral. You would have the totality of what it takes to make a transformational change rather than just focus on one little bit. So often these closed constructs show up as repetitive sentences in somebody's mind. And often when they're under stress, the sentence is going to show up in identical form. So repetition, it's usually something that has a lot of negative emotion associated with it that is disproportionate to the stimulus. So let's say you get a small rejection, but you have a lot of emotion. Or you make a small mistake, but you have a lot of shame, right? It is that oversized emotion in response to it. It is the language of must and shouldn't, language with which I think of it as a self-flagellating language fundamentally, often built, you have to think we weren't born with that language. When we were a toddler, we weren't thinking about how to, right? So I sometimes joke that we have, as toddlers, we'll have fantastic self-esteem, right? We lose it, but we can regain it. So another thing is that in that domain of closed construct, person is averse. They don't like to get new information. Because if you start telling them, you get uncomfortable. So if I have a closed construct around how much I can trust others, people talking to me about trust, it would just make me very uncomfortable. Why? Because I have a closed lid and somebody's trying to pour on top of it. It just feels like it can't go in and it makes me feel uncomfortable. So I'd rather not be in that situation. If you're a coach who is interested how to support a person through a full transformation, absolutely, yes, you can go to the LinkedIn course. You can see like a short version of the model of how to help people. And to be quite honest, I made it so that I've tried to make both the course and also the book in a way that will allow anybody fundamentally to be able to produce a transformation in themselves. I often tell coaches, try it. So do it on some aspect of yourself. And what you'll notice when you finish it, when you understand how quickly it can be done, you will be able to step in for the client in whichever stage they're at. So maybe they're in the stage where they don't know that they have something limiting them and they just keep saying, and then you can help them get to the insight, right? And what we talked about is why insight is necessary but not sufficient for transformation, right? You can know about something, but that knowing is not in the unconscious. It's just up here in the mind. And so, but perhaps they don't even know it in their mind. So you help them understand. You can help them understand what is it that they need to put into their unconscious that would help keep that spring open on that construct. What I find is that once either you can go to the LinkedIn course to see a very short version, it has all the exercises you need to take yourself through one potential transformation within a course of under a week. So, and some of the transformative techniques are as short as 1 hour, right? So like 20 minutes for 3 days. I sometimes tell people, you don't have to take my word for it, just try it. It lasts less than a bad Netflix show and see what happens. I find often once people understand how it works, they then can shape what they offer to their clients in a way that's helpful. And, I think it's time to take transformational process away from what used to be considered the purveyors of transformation, like therapists, which ironically sometimes didn't manage, or often don't manage to produce the transformation. And what I've tried is to give it back to individual people. So just somebody on the street can produce this. So it's a self-therapy. But I find that even with self-therapy, people often want a companion to their transformation. And that's what I think coaches are in a fantastic situation to provide the insight, support, enlightened support to help people guide themselves through transformation. So coaches shouldn't be afraid of, well, I'm not a therapist, I shouldn't. Well, you're not. It's that people will be in a self-therapeutic space, in what you will be is in a supportive space to support that transformation. So whether it's a LinkedIn course that I have, or the book that actually outlines all the techniques that are very simple and fast, try it and then see how you can best support your clients, not just try to really just force a different behavior, but transform fully such that they no longer need willpower to maintain their new way of being.